Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War news update, a third part thereof, the 2nd of June 2024. This is a geopolitical news update. Lots to talk about as ever. I'll try and rattle through it as quickly as possible. It's just one of these subjects, isn't it? The Ukraine War that seems to grow and grow and grow in how it interacts with all the other things going on around the world and how this is much more global than we might at first have realized. Now, we're going to start with Zelensky is in Singapore at the moment, the Ukrainian president, at a security conference. He's met with an awful lot of people. He's met with Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, already meeting with heads of states and high-ranking officials. Headlines are not being made by any of these meetings, says Tim White. Zelensky's launched a scathing attack on Russia. He accuses the Chinese state of, quote, disrupting the peace summit in Switzerland this month, doing everything to prevent some leaders from going to the peace summit, putting pressure on them actually supports the war. And indeed, we've just heard that Saudi Arabia are not going to the peace summit now. And you can imagine that they are having pressure put on them by China. China is de facto supporter of Russia, I guess, in this. It's, some interesting power plays going on there. But Zelensky, I'm finding at the moment, is, I think, giving up the airs and graces, the P's and Q's and the politeness at the moment. I think he's got to a point where he's just like, sod it, guys. Like, this is what needs to happen. Freaking get it done. Stop pussyfooting around and help us out. We've told you what we need. You say, no, yes. And then we ask you what we need, and you say, no, yes. We have this repeating cycle going on. Just let's cut to the chase. Let's get what we need as soon as possible. And I think he's really, now you could say that's really risky because you are playing with people's psyches here with, even though there's clear rationality that's not changing. The reason it's not changing and then it is changing is partly because of people's personalities and recalcitrance based on, what their background is, who they are, and their calculations to, it is risky because you could end up making people less likely to help you if you're being a bit more brutal with your honesty. But on the other hand, I can totally understand that. I completely understand it. 2.5 years into a war, and you're thinking, come on, guys, like, really? We're still having conversations about this, about using ATACMS in Belgorod Oblast? Really? That's a thing we're still discussing? Come on. Anyway, Zelensky met with Lloyd Austin in Singapore. The delivery of F-16 to Ukraine was discussed, as well as a signing of a security agreement with the US, which is imminent. The Pentagon chief believes that war with China can be avoided, he has said in a discussion. It is not inevitable or unavoidable. This is a quote from a piece from Associated Press. You can see it variously. New York Post, for example, is running that, but it is Associated Press. It's not inevitable or unavoidable. Dialogue is needed to avoid misunderstandings. In response, Chinese Lieutenant General Jing Jianfeng accused Washington of seeking to create an Asia-Pacific version of NATO. He called the US the biggest challenge to stability in the region and said the US strategy is divisive and provokes confrontation. In other words, I want to keep saying that we are inching our way towards, or in fact, more accurately, already in World War III. Here is another example of how precarious, how fragile things are in a number of places around the world. There is obvious and overt war taking place in Ukraine, but there are other theatres that are bubbling over, and that can be said for Taiwan. Now, imagine if Lloyd Austin had said 5 years ago that war with China is not inevitable or unavoidable, you'd be thinking, what's going on now? What's he talking about? What do you mean he's having to deny that we're definitely going to go to war with China? Why would that be necessary? That's because things are heating up. Things are in a very precarious position right now, geopolitically speaking. And then we have The White House saying this week that it moved at, quote, lightning speed to allow Kiev to use US weaponry to strike limited targets inside Russia. Sullivan, Austin and Brown listened intently on a secure video conference as their Ukrainian counterparts described their forces and civilians being battered by the Russian assault on Kharkiv. Over 90 minutes, the Ukrainians made a pressing case to be able to use US weapons to fire back over the border into Russia to prevent their city from being overrun. So the Americans are letting out that this happened incredibly quickly, all things considered. Other people are saying, really? It seemed to take forever, and it shouldn't have even been a discussion. This should have been the default position. So it depends how you interpret this. If you want to be overly generous to the Biden administration, then things moved incredibly quickly compared to I don't know what, or in terms of the seriousness of this decision. I guess you could make sense of that if this was a long-running kind of US military scenario, much like Andrea Perpetua's previously said. This is actually not a Ukraine war decision regarding the use of US weapons across borders. This is actually a long-running thing. That this is just another iteration of it. So you could say that to change that way of going about using US weapons is a really serious thing, and actually they did change their minds pretty quickly. That's your really charitable view on this, or you say it shouldn't have even been a discussion. Don't know what you're talking about. You should have been able to do this freaking literally years ago. Zelensky has also called for restrictions on ATACMS to be dropped. I dropped in on the Shills podcast live stream last night, where I talked about how there were restrictions on ATACMS. One of them asked actually what was the evidence that there was that. There's no actual official statements from the US. However, it was massively, and I responded later with a quote from an article, it has been massively widely reported, and it seems to be pretty accepted that the US had put restrictions on ATACMS. And it must be the case because Zelensky is now officially asking for those restrictions to be lifted. So the Russians have these weapons there, and they do not remove them because they know that Ukraine cannot target them with Western weaponry, even if they fire against us. Zelensky has said in the context of these ATACMS not being allowed to use ATACMS. Anton Gerashchenko says Russia puts in a great deal of effort to oppose the Swiss peace summit. Why is that? So this is going back to the idea of the peace summit that is to take place later in June. I'm trying to work out the date because it looked like the date of the peace summit overlaps with the G7 meeting, so I'm not sure. I probably got the dates wrong. Anyway, Russia puts in a great deal of effort to oppose the Swiss peace summit. Why is that? Diplomatic positions regarding the war in Ukraine and diplomatic participation are extremely important, as each participation and non-participation will be a clear demonstration of whose side the country is on. This is why it's important. Zelensky is calling out China and, by extension, Saudi Arabia, who are not turning up and making accusations. Zelensky is that China is undermining the peace process by trying to convince nations not to participate. The more countries and global leaders support Ukraine and our view of peace, the stronger Ukraine's position will be, and not just Ukraine's, of international law, democracy, respecting territorial integrity all over the world. This will be a loud and clear demonstration of values. That's why presence at the Swiss Peace Summit is so important. That's why the presence of President Biden is so important. Friends, I ask you to share this as widely as possible to help get the message out there. So a lot of pressure from Ukrainians. Here you can see Anton Gerashchenko. Yes, June the 15th. I think the G7 is the 13th to the 15th. So it must be that it goes one to the other. Now, the idea here is that Ukrainians want Biden to turn up. He may well do, might change his mind. I've said before that I would prefer to see Blinken there for the actual discussions and decision making. Biden might be more useful for just the icon of the US president being there, and therefore the emphasis and the seriousness being accorded with that. Now, Gerashchenko also says, as already mentioned, that China is undermining That, where did I see that? Oh, I missed it. Yeah, at the forum in Singapore, President Zelensky said that unfortunately Beijing is talking the countries of the global south out of participating in the peace summit in Switzerland, suggesting instead a plan of de facto freezing the war, which suits Russia, and that is particularly challenging for Ukraine. Zelensky, after being in Singapore, is going to, on the way to there now, or will be on the way to the Philippines. So he's the busiest politician, I think, in the world. It's the first visit to Manila after being elected in 2019. So trying to get Philippines on side. The Philippines are an important nation in the Indo-Pacific with regard to being more aligned with the US against China. The US have traditionally had bases there in military bases in the Philippines historically. And so, yeah, the Philippines is certainly important to Taiwan. They've had boats being attacked recently by the Chinese Coast Guard and whatnot. So it is all pretty hairy over there. So Ukraine trying to court the Philippines. And then here, as you can see, Zelensky will take part in the G7 summit, which will take place on June the 13th to 15th in Brindisi. And the Italian Prime Minister reports that, Giorgia Meloni. I hope that this expedites Meloni to, I guess, become... I mean, she personally is a strong supporter of Ukraine. The problem is she's in a coalition with two other very right-wing parties, one of which is led by Matteo Salvini. The other one was led by Silvio Berlusconi. I don't know who's in charge now because he's recently died. But Silvio Berlusconi was a personal friend of Putin. Matteo Salvini is one of these pro-Russian populists. And so she, as a right-wing leader herself, is on the kind of more conservative, I guess, more traditionally conservative foreign policy side of things with regard to how to deal with Russia, and she's been very, very supportive of Ukraine. But there have been some decisions that have been made, such as not using Italian weapons over the border, whereas almost every other European nation has said that's fine. I just hope that she does end up being just as supportive of Ukraine as she has been with her rhetoric previously. And then we have an article concerning the UK intelligence here services focus on Russia and China threat rather than terrorists, MI5 are told. I hinted at this yesterday. I just want to read you some of this because I think this is a really important shift. I went out for my partner's mother's 80th birthday today, and obviously the subject of what I do came up, and a few people there. And I was saying that I was talking about exactly this. Like, I was kind of saying, look, we're in the throes of World War III, but no one really realizes it. And it's interesting that the UK intelligence said we need to shift our focus kind of away from Islamic terrorism and how that pertains to operations in the UK and probably abroad as well, to refocus. It's not necessary to forget about that, but just to reprioritize what's going on in the almost old school Cold War framework. We need to shift back to think about this. So as the Telegraph says, while domestic and international terrorism remain a priority for MI5, more resources are now being pushed towards Russian, Chinese and Iranian counter-espionage operations, government sources have said. MI5 has been asked by ministers to, quote, refocus a lot of their efforts on the espionage threat, particularly the state threat from China, Russia and more recently Iran as well. Senior government source has said. They insisted that, quote, counter-terrorism has not been deprioritized, but this has been prioritized alongside it, adding that, quote, their workload has definitely shifted in that direction. The source pointed out in the wake of the 2018 Salisbury Novichok attack, so that's where Sergei Skripal was attacked with Novichok. 2 people ended up dying, but not Skripal or his daughter, who were badly affected but didn't die. But some other random sort of British people did die, and we I don't think reacted strongly enough to that. But anyway, Russia lost a large chunk of their intelligence officers overnight. So one thing that did happen is, we got rid of a lot of scare quotes diplomats and whatnot, and we just removed a bunch of their espionage. And this has been happening in Europe, interestingly. So what they used to say about, as far as I understand it, about spies and scare quotes diplomats is that it's actually more useful to keep them in place rather than to get rid of them. Because if you keep them in place, you can monitor them, and then you know what they're up to, and then you know who their contacts are. Whereas if you get rid of them, then new people are brought in and you're not quite sure who they are and what's going on. But actually, there's been this move since particularly the beginning of the war in Ukraine to just get rid of a whole load of Russian scare quotes diplomats, spies, and ship them off. Now, the issue with the kind of particularly Schengen EU areas where you've got free movement of people, but also in kind of diplomatic circles, is there's the idea that you can move some of these people from one country to another once they're kind of found out, or once they become too problematic. But I think the EU is being quite unified. The issues are in places like Hungary, possibly Slovakia, but Hungary, where you end up getting a load of these people being able to work okay. Now, why I think this is important and also warranted is that, as I keep saying, we're in an iteration of another world war in lots of different ways, and one of them is in the information space and the cyberspace, etc., etc. So I think that is understandable that the UK intelligence services are going to refocus here, but also pragmatically, there's just more of a threat than there would be from Islamic terrorism. So Islamic terrorism is going to give you an incident in a crowded place, or like maybe a horrific outcome, but that is kind of localized and not so like big scale, not so geopolitical. I think when you're talking about Russia, China and Iran as being threats against, say, Islamic extremism, I think you're talking about two really different things. And I think one can have an effect on maybe a whole economy. One can have an effect in a whole kind of war, in a way that Islamic fundamentalism, yes, there is the context of the Middle East and Syria, etc., but and actual wars there. But I just think that these are two they're almost operating on two different dimensions, and I think it is really important to refocus and not to give up on worrying about all these other areas as well. But we do definitely need to focus on China, Russia, and Iran, evidently, because people with much more knowledge than I have said so. In light of that, and this is fascinating because it's exactly what I was saying. Is when I was last on Touchney, this is what I was talking about. I'm going to talk about this when I give my talk in Andover area in Hampshire. We're in June, in a couple of weeks' time. Actually, better work out what I'm going to talk about here. This is one of the things which is, functionally, cyber warfare can be no different from conventional warfare in certain evaluations. So if you are going to attack a hospital so that the mortality rate rises in the hospital, and the hospital stops operating in a way that you would like it to, and it costs you loads of money through ransomware attacks, right? Then what's the difference between driving a tank, blowing up some of the hospital, it costing more money to fix the hospital, and the mortality rates going up? Then there's functionally no different. But one, with the tank, you're like, that's war, we're going to war, Russia's invaded us with a tank. When it comes down to or dropped a bomb, when it comes down to cyber warfare, we're like exactly the same outcome, but you're like, okay, nothing to see here. Probably was Russia. Now here we have Admiral Rob Bauer, who's a NATO officer, saying a cyber attack on one of the NATO countries could become a reason for the application of Article 5. And this is super serious, but I think it should be talked about this. Now, I have to say, I think this comment has come out of the security conference in Singapore, but the only sources I can find for this exact quote, and this is what annoys me about Max24 and other sources like this. I still use Max24, but I know the limits there, which is, and Nexter does this as well, is often you don't see the sources for this. And you're like, okay, brilliant. I need to check that. So I then have to go and spend my time looking for the sources. The sources appear to be RT Today and some other Russian sources. So pinch of salt and all that. Bauer admitted, says Max23, that it would be necessary to establish precisely that the attack was carried out by the state and not by a private individual. And here's the issue with cyber warfare, is plausible deniability. So when you have a Russian a tank or Russian aircraft dropping a bomb or firing a shell, you are pretty certain, because the evidence is right there staring you in the face, that that's a Russian tank and it's trundled across the border and it's taken a shot. So we know that's Russia that's attacked us. But with cyber warfare, you have entities who you are pretty sure are working in unison with, or on the orders of the Russian state, but they can deny it. And they can say, hey, we don't know who these guys are, sandworm, schmanworm. So as a result, it's a little bit more difficult to say, right, that's now triggered Article 5, because actually they can say, but it wasn't us. It wasn't us. You don't have 100% proof that it was us, or near as damn it proof. This presents a little bit of a challenge when you are talking about how to react to cyber warfare. And the other issue that I've talked about previously is that we're probably doing an awful lot similar to the Russians or Chinese in this domain. Anyway, 5 coffins, so moving on to another topic here. 5 coffins were placed at the foot of the Eiffel Tower, accompanied by a banner reading French soldiers of Ukraine. According to the police, 3 people... So the idea is that if you're going to send French soldiers to Ukraine, they're going to come back in coffins, in body bags. Now, according to the police, 3 people were arrested, two men on the run who were about to take a bus to Berlin, and a third, the driver of the van. The 2 men were arrested at Bercy bus station. They were where they were trying to catch a bus to Germany. The driver of the van was stopped shortly after the incident and taken into police custody. He told police that he had been paid €40 to drop off the men and their shipment. He also said he had arrived from Bulgaria the night before. So here we have people coming from Eastern Europe, almost certainly under the directive of the Russians, and this is the information war, the propaganda war, the cyber war, this hybrid warfare that is taking place. This is one way that Russia are trying to manipulate the thoughts of the French population. This is a way that Russia is involving France in this war, or reacting to France's involvement. Is just another way of doing war. This is just war with minds, and they have placed those coffins there under a banner on the behest, no doubt, of the Kremlin. If you follow the money and the personnel, I'm sure you will get back to the Kremlin. Now, I don't know that this is actually connected to Russia directly. But, and I almost reported on this yesterday, but didn't. But I'm going to now, because enough people are talking about it. Some people are connecting this directly to Ukraine. So we have more details, says Tendo's, a German source, regarding the perpetrator who assaulted Roderick Kiesewetter. So Kiesewetter is an opposition leader, an opposition politician, who's incredibly vocal in his support for Ukraine. In fact, I think he had just given a talk on Ukraine, and he was physically attacked. Now, the first thing to note is that there seems to be a spate of these physical attacks on German politicians taking place in Germany at the moment. Any German viewer, I'd like your opinion on that. It is a challenge, obviously, for German politics in general. You know, you want to have everyone should be safe, and you shouldn't be thinking that your life is going to be put in danger just for sounding out regular political positions. Anyway, the person who attacked Kiesewetter was close to the Querdenker group, basically the German version of QAnon. The police already had a file regarding him, and of course it was about Roderick's strong stance on helping other nations, such as Ukraine. We all knew what it was about, that it was about this when the news hit. So you can't directly connect this, but it's a sort of, the kind of pro-Ukraine. Imagine that this person is a Marjorie Taylor Greene follower. And it's that kind of thinking. I considered the assault against Roderick also a personal matter. Aside that I share many of his stances, I frequently wear the German-Ukrainian friendship pin, as I think Kiesewetter was. So far, never had any issues, instead only thumbs up. And even if it would be different, I would still not be deterred. Again, please recover well, Roderick. Gute Besserung, Roderick. I think Roderick. I don't know, that's my German. I will keep doing my best attempt to do accents, and that's not in any kind of joke fashion. I was seriously trying to do German, but I'm sure you will tell me it was terrible. Julie Davis from Russian War Monitor says, meanwhile in Russia, state TV host Vladimir Solovyov threatened Germany, promising that German cities will resemble the town of Vovchansk, which is an apocalyptic hellscape right now. German cities will resemble the town of Vovchansk in Ukraine that has largely been destroyed by the Russians. This kind of rhetoric is continual to the point where we almost don't pay any attention to it because it's just the same old Russian nonsense. But what they're saying is absolutely horrendous. Open threats to all these other countries. When you want to know what Russians think, turn on the TV. And there you have it. There you go, Germany, watch out. Russia may recognise child-free as an extremist ideology. So they have recognised that LGBTQ+, any kind of deviance or difference or non-normative behaviour, as they would define it, is now seen as extremist ideology. So basically, if you have any kind of gay bar in Moscow, you're going to be closed down for being extremist, right? For being effectively terrorist. I mean, it's insane. And of course, individual liberty is going out the window because authoritarianism. Well, it's interesting that being child-free, as in deciding not to have children, will be seen as an extremist ideology. This is, my goodness, like Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale all over again. This is Gilead to some degree, isn't it? Absolutely incredible. This was announced by Deputy Speaker of the State, Peter Tolstoy. And of course, they do have issues with their demographics. They do have issues with a shrinking population in terms of killing them by sending them to Ukraine. But in terms of birth rates, I mean, before the war started, they had birth rates that were not replacing their mortality rates or I guess net migration, etc., etc. So they desperately need children or immigrants, the one or the other or both, in order to be a viable economy going forward. But then, of course, if you are doing everything you're doing with the war, and then you are klepto-mobilizing migrants who are coming to your country and sending them to war, then you're not really going to be attracting people to your country. Therefore, you're going to try and make it attractive to have children. So you'll probably do things like, we'll give you more benefits if you have children or whatever. But then it gets to the stage where, that's not working. And actually, we haven't got much money. So let's just go good old school authoritarian and say, if you don't have kids, you are an extremist and we're going to put you in prison. So you better have some bleeding kids. And by the way, when I say you need to have some kids, I mean like 9 of them at least. And there you go. That's what freedom looks like in Russia. The US will cease to be a world leader if Trump becomes president and ends Russia's war with Ukraine on Moscow's terms, Zelensky has stated. And this is going back to the idea that Zelensky has kind of taken off his gloves and said, right, let's do this. Let's go. I'm going to trade fists with whoever is going to be willing to trade fists with me. And I'm going to forget all the niceties. I'm going to tell it how it is. The problem is, of course, he might burn bridges by doing this. because I'm sure there'll be certain of you out there, and I know some of you out there who are massive Trump supporters. I don't know how you can be pro-Ukraine and pro-Trump, or at least, my goodness, there's some serious cognitive dissonance involved in that, because it's fairly obvious with what Trump is saying. It's fairly obvious. His son was saying it only yesterday, or the video came out of him, taking a mickey out of Zelensky. We know what his advisors have said. We know what Trump has said over the past however long. I've done a whole video on Trump and his history with Ukraine. It is freaking obvious that he's not supportive of Ukraine. I don't care what you say, because you're bastardizing the past. You're ignoring the actual words that Trump has said, right? So you can come onto my threads and say X, Y, and Z. Go and deal with the facts, right? Anyway, it's obvious that these are the facts of the matter, because Zelensky, as the leader of the country who has met Trump, who has been attempted to be bribed by Trump, is saying this. So he's got to believe it, and he's pretty much in the know, a little bit more than we are, with regard to how he thinks Trump is going to act with Ukraine. Anyway, it's not quite like I'm portraying it in terms of like it's all going south if Trump becomes leader. It's a bit more nuanced than that. Let's have a little look at it. So anyway, he has said after this, Putin goes further, then who will this new president of the US be for the whole world? He's kind of saying, I don't quite understand, does Trump really want to be a loser president? I mean, that is hardcore rhetoric. It's not going to go down well with the MAGA Republicans, that's for sure. And I think, but maybe it's like, cut my losses. Like, I can try and convince the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, but it just ain't working. So I'm just going to say it how it is. This is how it is. If you appreciate Ukraine, you probably don't want to be voting Trump. Now, he's not saying that, but that's the inference I read. So anyway, a really big Guardian article about this, but this is being reported widely at the moment. So Zelensky, Trump risks being loser president if he imposes a bad deal on Ukraine. So it's not like he will be a loser president. It's if he does this, then that will be the case. So Donald Trump risks being a loser president if he wins November's election and imposes a bad deal on Ukraine, Zelensky has said, saying it would mean the end of the US as a global player. This is really interesting because he's talking to this idea that Trump is isolationist and wants to take the US out of the, he wants to stop investing in NATO, investing in global security, investing in the US being involved here, there, and everywhere around the world. Fine, if that's what you want to do, you just have to understand what the ramifications of doing that will be, and you will recede from the world, and you won't be a global player, which means you can't reap the benefits of being a global player. Then you'll be an isolationist, you'll be this little bubble, you'll whack tariffs on all Chinese goods and all that. Yep, fair enough, okay, but then you will have massive inflation, you'll put a wall up for all people coming in for your country. Okay, fair enough, do that, but just understand what that will mean for the US in terms of your position in the world. And if you fully understand those ramifications, then by all means go for it. You do that. That's fair enough. And if that's what your population want, if that's what they want to vote for, then fair enough. But let's hope that they are at least informed enough to know that those will be the ramifications. It's one thing to say, yeah, let's put tariffs on everything, without understanding that, yeah, cool, okay, you can make some sense of that, protect your own industries. I get that. This is industry protectionism. Cool. And I'm not against that, by the way, but just understand that it will send your prices right up. And if you guys are getting annoyed about inflation at the moment, which the US has the best handle on inflation of all the major economies around the world, right? And you're still moaning about that, holy cow, you're going to be in for a fright. So in an interview with the Guardian in Kyiv, Zelensky said he had no strategy yet for what to do if Trump returned to the White House, and that the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had approached him on his behalf. In other words, when both Boris Johnson and we now know David Cameron went to the White House, they were lobbying, not the White House, to Mar-a-Lago and to meet with Trump. They were lobbying on Zelensky's behalf. If Trump beats Joe Biden, he is widely expected to cut off US military support to Ukraine. Last year, Trump boasted he could end the war in 24 hours. Trump's aides had previously sketched out a possible plan that could involve giving Ukraine's eastern regions to Russia as well as Crimea. But Zelensky made it clear that, quote, Ukrainians would not put up with that, nor would they accept a Russian ultimatum that forced Ukraine to abandon integration with Europe and future membership of NATO, he said. Zelensky acknowledged that a re-elected Trump could, if he really wanted to, impose a crushing military defeat on Ukraine. He could cut off, quote, support, weapons and money, and even, quote, make deals with Kiev's partners so they stop deliveries of vital arms. Quote, Ukraine, barehanded without weapons, will not be able to fight a multi-million Russian army, Zelensky told The Guardian. Speaking inside his presidential headquarters, he said he thought this scenario was unlikely, but he said that if it happened, there would be grave consequences for the US's standing in the world, as well as for Trump personally. Quote, does he want to be a loser president? Do you understand what can happen? Zelensky said. In other words, it's not to say that if he gets in, he's going to be a loser president. If he gets in and cuts off all aid to Ukraine and then goes down this isolationist route while also forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table and making Ukraine submit to the desires of Putin, then he becomes that kind of president. He predicted that Putin would violate any Trump brokered deal. Quote, a ceasefire is a trap, he said. After a pause, Putin would quote, go further, humiliating Trump and make him look very weak in the eyes of the world, he said. Zelensky continued, this is not about him, that's Trump, as a person, but about the institutions of the United States. They will become very weak. The US will not be the leader of the world anymore. Yes, it will be powerful, first of all, in the domestic economy, because it has a powerful economy, without a doubt. But in terms of international influence, it will be equal to zero. Realizing that Washington was no longer, quote, a player, other mostly authoritarian countries and leaders would, quote, come into the arena and emulate Putin's aggressive approach, Zelensky suggested. I agree with this. If the US wants to isolate itself and regress from international integration and influence projects and so on and so forth, they will not be able to do the kind of trade deals that they're used to doing. There will be gaps. There will be vacuums left where the US retreats that will be filled by almost certainly authoritarian regimes. China will fill in the gaps. It's just, I don't see it happening really any other way. This would ultimately end in global disaster. Quote, the beginning of what everyone is so afraid to talk about. This is reality, and this is a real Third World War. And there you hear it from Zelensky himself. Asked whether Johnson had spoken to Trump on Ukraine's behalf, Zelensky said, I think he tried, and I think he spoke to him. I think so, yes, as far as I know. He added, I'm sorry that I'm using Boris as an instrument. Interesting. And then later on in the article, Zelensky said to have invited Trump to visit Ukraine. Quote, I want to talk to him openly. I want him to come and see the war for himself and then to talk to him. I think he would need to understand the situation better. I totally agree. I just don't think Trump even remotely understands the Ukraine war. I don't think RFK Jr. understands it with his latest tweet about Beograd. I mean, he doesn't even know these places that he's talking about. Belgorod. It's just, honestly, like, there's a level of ignorance because they're so invested in these ideas of what they want domestically that knowledge about foreign affairs is kind of an afterthought. Zelensky said he understood that Trump, quote, knows Putin based on the former president's own, quote, statements. The pair have met at diplomatic summits. Trump has previously called the Russian leader a genius and described his 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine as, quote, pretty savvy. Communicating with Putin was not the same as knowing him, Zelensky said, adding that to understand him better, Trump should, quote, see the results of what he brought to Ukraine. A reference to the destruction of towns and cities, murders of civilians, and daily bombardment from Russian missiles. Absolutely right. Trump needs to get his ass out there straight away. Trump denied doing that because he said, it's not befitting of someone who's not president to do that. And then the next day, put the red carpet out in front of Mar-a-Lago and made it look like the White House, and then accepted Viktor Orban, the president of another nation, in. Oh, I can't do anything that's kind of a bit too grandiose like that. Welcome in. Let's pretend that this is the White House, I'm the president, and you, Viktor Orban, can come into my house. So, yeah. no time for that. And this is what he's just said again. So again, kind of listen to the words of the man himself.
People don't want to be impeached. They don't want to be indicted by these scoundrels who are much more evil than people. I'm telling you, China and Russia, they're not the problem. We have a problem from within that's really bad.
So Judge Merchan, who bent over backwards, to be fair to Trump, if you know the actual details of that trial, he says it was rigged and he's treated poorly. He was treated well beyond what anyone else would have been allowed. Well beyond. Look at the facts. Don't listen to what Fox News tell you. Look at the facts. And he's saying that Judge Merchan and people like that are much worse than Putin and Xi Jinping. Blows my mind. Blows my mind. And of course, what happened in his last 10 years, and you think, well, he achieved a tax cut, those Trump tax cuts that were actually, they're still paying for. There's a huge deficit in the coffers, and that money went to the rich. And in fact, that was about his biggest, really, his crowning achievements. But when you actually look at what's been happening, the US economy is in a really good place compared to all other economies around the world. It's bounced back really, really well. The CHIPS Act is attracting, as mentioned here by Martin Schulzemper, CHIPS Act is attracting insane amounts of investment. The US is now on pace to add more investment in electronics manufacturing construction this year alone, as it did total from 1996 until passage of the CHIPS Act in 2020. Funding not yet secured then, but investment started. And then when you look at this is just insane stats, but people don't really understand what's going on or aren't cognizant of this. At its 2-year anniversary, the bipartisan infrastructure law continues to rebuild all of America. The Brookings Institute talks about how and actually that had bipartisan support in Congress, but this is Biden's administration has been doing proper governance where they're like, let's try and make America better. Oh, it is better. Look at our economy, it's operating better than every other G7 nation. And yet all we hear from Trump is like inflation. Well, actually, it's doing well, all things considered. And crime rates, you're lying, literally lying about that. And immigration, you stopped the immigration bipartisan bill being passed. So, to me, it's a no-brainer as far as voting in November 2024. It's like you vote for someone that's actually not very clever, not very astute, but blows lots of dog whistles and gets people on board for that. Or you've got a tenure from 2020, certainly until the last session of Congress, that's become stagnant because of Republicans. They admit that themselves. You listen to what Mitch McConnell said, you listen to what Langford said, you listen to all these Republicans that are saying, we've only got ourselves to blame that we're not getting anything passed. Like, the US has done a pretty good job the last 4 years. It's in a pretty good place. And that's in a context of the world going to shit, right? So you've got, and that's not the US's fault, by the way. I know you'd like to blame Biden for all that, as if he's simultaneously Sleepy Joe that can't do anything and also masterminding all the shit that's going down in the world. It's Schrodinger's Biden. Like what is he? Is he sleepy and useless and doddery and completely demented? He has a dementia brain, or is he the mastermind of all the things that are going wrong that you're blaming on him? Okay, because both of those things can't be true. So there is an awful lot going wrong in the world, and yes, I think the Biden administration could be doing much better with how to support Ukraine, much better at the moment. But it's a damn sight better than it would be under Trump, and I can bet my mortgage on that one. The G7 wants to tighten the screws on banks that help Russia circumvent sanctions. This is good news. G7 is exploring measures to target third country lenders that use the Bank of Russia's SWIFT-like financial communication system, the one that was kind of invented to circumvent the sanctions, to circumvent trade restrictions, right? The discussions come ahead of the G7 meeting where the heads of government intend to agree on a set of measures to better implement sanctions imposed on Russia for its armed aggression in Ukraine. And then that leads me to this, which is, let's look at who's helping out Russia here. Well, it's Serbia. Well, Kyrgyzstan, we know, is this staging point for dual purpose goods and all sorts of other goods that go into Russia, get exported from countries that should know better. But it turns out that Serbia, which is under the Russian sphere of influence outside the EU, supposedly has designs on joining the EU, but doesn't really, because President Vucic is a Russian puppet. Serbian exports to Kyrgyzstan are up, how much? 6,200% from pre-invasion. These goods obviously never go to Kyrgyzstan, they go straight to Russia. The EU should immediately cancel Serbia's application to join the EU. Serbia is free to behave badly, but is not free to join the EU. And of course, we see Germany doing similar though. German exports to Kyrgyzstan are up. Where are we? Are up from pre-invasion. These goods obviously never go to Kyrgyzstan. They go straight to Russia. The EU should immediately kick them out. Oof, ouch. That's harsh as well. But something needs to be done about both of these countries. And I'm sure it's not just these countries. The US is doing the same. Other countries, we're all doing the same. That's why I never blame these countries individually. It's just, although I think Serbia, it's more probably sanctioned by the Serbian government, whereas these are it's often companies, corporations that are trying to make a profit, irrespective of morality, and they will just get around that. And our governments, if they are to do what they where they're morally and politically positioning themselves, they need to come down heavy on these sanctions evaders that will be just fulfilling like free market desires and whatnot. Now, Robin Brooks also then goes on to say China is the biggest enabler of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the stats talk for themselves here, speak for themselves. The rise in China's exports to Russia more than offset the fall in G7 exports. So while G7 sanctioned Russia and said, right, we're not going to sell a load of stuff to Russia, China went, thank you very much, we will, don't have a problem with that. And we'll pick up. So when I talk about if the US want to recede from the world, who's going to step in? Because Russia are pretty good at stepping in when there's vacuums. That's why it's key for the EU to stop re-export of Western goods to Russia via Central Asia. Russian access to Western goods must stop. And this is where the US Treasury's work with regard to secondary sanctions on financial institutions are super, super, super important. And that's how you get places like China. That's why you get AliExpress saying, "Yeah, we're not going to continue our work in Russia at the moment because of that tightening of the screw on their operations by the US Treasury." And China's defense minister, just in case you were wondering whether we were indeed meandering our way towards a world war with guns and bullets from ourselves. China's defense minister says anyone who dares to separate Taiwan from China, quote, will be smashed to pieces. Quote, China stays committed to peaceful reunification. That's Taiwan coming back under the umbrella of China. However, this prospect is increasingly being eroded by separatists for Taiwan independence and foreign forces, Dong warned. His comments come as there has been heightened concern in the region over Beijing's military and economic intimidation of Taiwan, which has grown more pronounced under Chinese leader Xi Jinping. This is all very worrying. Things are just going very south at the moment, and we need to be very careful, but also we need to be strong and robust and not roll over while China and Russia get to dictate what the red lines are. This is another of those examples where we should have gotten there first and said to China, do you know what? You can't do this. You know what, Russia? You can't do this. Rather than wait for Russia to dictate all these red lines, and then we're the ones that go, oh, we okay to get, oh no, nothing happened. Okay, how about okay, nothing happened. We need to be going to Russia and say, do you know what? If you do this, we're going to hit you with X, Y, and Z. So we've got the red lines, and how about you don't cross them? Anyway, that's enough from me. You've had enough of me banging on today. Thanks for watching. There's a lot of stuff in here, a lot for me to talk about. So sorry it's gone on for 50 minutes. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon. Toodle pips.